When using government R&D funds, there are so many different cases. I am always confused as to whether I can use the R&D funds for certain matters.
I agree. I believe there must be criteria for research expenses.
I just want to know a few cases. Where can I find such information? When using R&D funds, you should remember the 4 rules. Direct costs can be calculated when directly related to the R&D project and it is necessary to achieve research aims. It should comply with relevant laws and regulations, such as the National R&D Innovation Act. R&D credit card and wire transfers shall be used to prove the R&D expense history of use, project fund use detail. It is important to avoid conflicts of interest to prevent problems amongst researchers. Based on these 4 rules, let's take a look at some precautions to consider when using research funds by case. When allocating labor funds to participating researchers, rules related to the availability of cash payments, the accounting rate, the 3 PIs, and the 5 researchers participating in government-funded R&D projects should be obeyed. In universities, researchers can participate at a rate of up to 100% of the labor cost counting rate. Even if the labor cost counting rate is 0%, one researcher acting as the PI cannot exceed the 3 project limit and cannot participate in more than 5 joint research projects. If the labor cost counting rate is 0%, 0% should be entered as 0% on the integrated Easy Barrow system. Participants who set their personnel expenses reimbursement rate at 0% will not be eligible to receive personnel expenses. However, direct costs such as research activity fee are still available for use. Paying labor costs exceeding 100% of the labor counting rate or creating false registrations are examples of research fund misuse. Specifically, collecting and managing paid labor wages or using them for other purposes would lead to the imposition of restrictions, such as no participation in R&D projects and fines. When allocating labor funding to participating researchers, the rules pertaining to the availability of cash payments, the accounting rate, the 3 PIs, and the 5 researchers jointly participating should be obeyed. Student labor wages. Student labor wages are the wages paid to student researchers who participate in an R&D project. In principle, student researchers should participate in R&D projects and should account for the cost of their labor. If a student has other income, the student can participate in the R&D project without accounting for their labor costs. When calculating the labor cost counting rate for student labor, short-term labor income and startup income are not included. It is not permissible to withdraw or use students' labor funds for other purposes without any justifiable reasons. Thus, such funds are not to be withdrawn and be used for lab management or other purposes. If found, research grants may be withdrawn, restrictions may be imposed on R&D participation, and fines and request for police investigation may be imposed. More importantly, if researchers can no longer conduct research, they will experience a fall from grace as a researcher. Research facilities and equipment purchased with R&D funds must be completed and installed 2 months prior to the final day of the research. Also, compensation for delays or contract performance deposits received from the purchasing organization due to a delivery delay should be returned to the government. If researchers violate the relevant laws and regulations during the process of purchasing research items by creating false transaction statements or any false evidence, sanctions such as participation restrictions in national R&D activities, monetary sanctions, and/or the recovery of R&D expenses may be imposed, and a request for police may follow. Purchasing and inspecting activities should comply with the R&D institution's regulations according to the National Innovation R&D Act. Research activity costs are expenses used for activities directly related to the research project, such as travel expenses, meeting costs, and laboratory operating expenses. Business trip expenses, expert consultation fees, meeting expenses, and lab expenses can be allocated when directly related to the R&D project and the purpose of the research aims. A business trip plan and a business trip result report must be submitted for overseas travel expenses. External expert consultation fees can be allocated within 40% of direct costs. However, if the funding agency approves of the project terms, the external expert consultation fees can exceed 40%. Let's look at examples of the misuse of research activity cost. The payment of external expert consultation fees to participating researchers in R&D projects or researchers in his or her lab is a typical misuse of research activity funds. Meeting expenses shall be only charged if the meeting includes participants from other organizations. It is a violation of the law to create false minutes or to submit false proof. Research incentives. Research incentives are subsidies paid to principal investigators and researchers who participate in an R&D project. Research incentives exceeding 20% of the nominal salary shall not be dispersed. If there are no student researchers in the R&D project period, all student labor costs included in the nominal salary should be excluded. If there are more than 2 participating researchers, the research incentives that can be paid to one participating researcher shall not exceed 70% of the total amount of the research incentives. If the research incentive amount is reduced differently compared to how it is stated in the R&D proposal at the time of the contract, this rule pertains to the reduced amount. In addition, to use 100% of the allocated research incentives, the direct costs use ratio should exceed 80%. If the research incentive payment ratio exceeds the direct costs use rate by 20%, it is not permissible, and the amount must be withdrawn. Research incentives are different from labor costs and thus should not be allocated as normal labor costs. Because increases in labor costs should not directly reflect research incentives proportionally, a more flexible approach is required when dispersing research incentives. International joint R&D expenses. International joint R&D expenses should be paid to R&D institutions or international scholars when conducting research jointly with institutions abroad or international scholars as prescribed by the R&D agreement. If the funding agency approves, the international joint R&D expenses shall be allocated based on the R&D project agreement. When an agreement between an R&D institution and international institutions is submitted in the research proposal, it may be considered that the funding agency approved of the proposal. If international joint R&D expenses are transferred or replaced by an account located abroad, they shall be regarded as used R&D expenses in the report. However, the use of international joint R&D expenses should comply with the criteria set forth by the Ministry of Science and Technology and the ICT in the Notice of R&D Funding Usage. I didn't know research incentives are related to the rate of direct cost use.
I found out that an increase in labor costs does not mean that research incentives have to increase proportionally. We should think about recording all research incentives as direct costs.
Yes, the misuse of research incentives is one of the most frequently occurring situations related to an inappropriate disbursement. We appreciate all researchers who conduct R&D projects. Proper R&D spending is the first step toward the maintenance of a responsible research environment.